At the beginning of the 20th century, China was at the crossroads of the ancient and the modern, the East and the West. The old dynasty had collapsed, but a new order had not yet been established. In such a tumultuous time, an ideological change called the New Culture movement quietly began. Its banner was two seemingly simple but profound words, Mr. De, democracy, and Mr. Sci, science. But have you ever wondered why these two words? Was the New Culture movement really just an imitation of the West? Or did it harbor the ideals, struggles, and even confusions of the Chinese themselves? In 1915, the launch of a magazine, New Youth, ignited a cultural storm. At a time when the embers of feudalism had yet to be dispersed and the desire for modernization was coming in like a tidal wave, a group of young scholars shouted out two names, Mr. De and Mr. Sci. Democracy and science. This was not a political manifesto, nor was it the promotion of laboratory results. It was a cry of ideas, the spiritual coordinates of this ancient country's attempt to move towards the modern world. Why them? Why, in the 5,000 years of Chinese civilization, should these two imported banners be held high? Because the old world is collapsing, but the new world has not yet come. Traditional Confucianism is no longer sufficient to support the social order, the imperial examination was abolished and the imperial system ended, but people's hearts are not liberated and their minds are still shackled. Democracy, meaning equality and civil will, is the end of authoritarian kingship. Science, on the other hand, represents rationality, evidence and empirical evidence, and is a farewell to empty superstition. They are the scarcest but most urgently needed spiritual resources in that turbulent era. Chen Duxiu said, "Democracy is the people's mastery, science is the weapon to break down superstition." They were not imitators of the West, but explorers of ideas. They believed, to transform China, we can't just repair machines and build factories. It's more important to liberate the mind and awaken the heart. So they chose to start with culture. They used words to break the silence, and used education to shock prejudice. They firmly believe that the change of a country is never just a reconstruction of guns and systems, but also an awakening of people. Every Chinese should have the ability to think rationally and the possibility to participate in public life. Democracy and science are not decorative slogans. They are the keys to modernity for the Chinese people, and the path to national transformation. All this may be just the light of an ideal, but it is this light that has made China think seriously for the first time. What kind of country we want to be, and what kind of citizens we want to be. But are ideas alone enough? Could the banners of democracy and science really penetrate the heavy ground? This is the embarrassment that the New Culture movement encountered from the very beginning of its spread. It aroused the blood of the intellectual class, but it failed to move the broader Chinese society. Most of the initiators of the New Culture movement were Western-educated elites. They stood on the rostrums of Peking University and shouted, "Down with Confucius." But by the time their speeches were printed, 90% of the Chinese people could not even pronounce the name democracy. They didn't understand Mr. Science. And they didn't know if Mr. Science was Sci. This is not the fault of the people. It's a gap in time. The New Culture movement was a revolution of the mind. But it was stuck on the ground. In a China where industrialization has not been completed, where the illiteracy rate is as high as 80%, and where national unification has not yet been achieved. Talking about democracy and science is like building a house in the wind. Bone-skinny ideals have collided with flesh and blood realities. What's more, the spread of democracy and science lacked institutional support. Under the turbulent Beiyang government, the country was in a state of disarray. Who could allocate funds for scientific education? Who would guarantee the freedom of opinion for democracy? Mr. Sci had just taken to the streets, and before he had a chance to speak, was scared away by the gunfire of the warlords. Perhaps the most fatal aspect of the movement was its literati nature. Almost all the participants in the new culture were literati. They had high ideals, but often belittled the complexity of practice. They criticized Confucius and ritualism in their writings. But they forgot that Confucius had already been transformed into the ethical structure of millions of families, embedded in people's language, habits and routines. Hu Shi, Chen Duxiu and Li Dazhao all believed that ideas could awaken the people and reshape the country. But their voices, more often than not, seemed to be floating in mid-air, too far away from the lives of the majority of the people, too abstract. They are believers and idealists. But the times don't always listen to idealistic words. The fire of ideas, though weak, is still burning. They may not have been able to change China immediately, but they planted the seeds of skepticism and discernment in China, and opened the windows of the mind for later revolutionaries, reformers and educators. If thought is a sharp carving knife, then whose heart does it carve into? How deep can it go? The ideal of the new culture movement was to transform national character and awaken modern consciousness. However, this cultural enlightenment is slowly revealing an embarrassment. It seems to have changed the voice of culture, but failed to shake the foundation of culture. Participants of the new culture movement, such as Hu Shi, Chen Duxiu, and Li Dazhao, were all exploring one thing: whether a truly modern civilization could be achieved without destroying the essence of Chinese culture. Hu Shi advocated bold assumptions and careful proof, and implemented the reform of the vernacular language. He hoped to use popular language to spread rational thoughts. He wanted to use popular language to disseminate rational ideas. However, a person who can change the language may not be able to change the context of the society. Chen Duxiu, on the other hand, was even more radical. He held high the banner of democracy and science, and repeatedly criticized Confucius and Mencius in New Youth, and even rejected the Confucian system directly. However, in a society like China, where rituals are deeply rooted, anti-traditional voices are easily regarded as disloyal and unfilial, words of a rebellious son. Culture is not just an academic matter. It is buried in every detail of how people eat, dress, and respect their elders and children. This is the biggest dilemma of Chinese modernization. Traditional culture is not an abstract enemy. It lives in every human body, engraved in habits and ethics. Even if you criticize it, you can't get away from it. Therefore, the radicalization of the new culture movement is not unreasonable. It is an attempt to break free and a cry of struggle. Therefore, some people questioned: is it necessary to change the heart or the system first for the transformation of culture? Should the people be educated first, or should the old power be subverted first? Li Dazhao's answer was, to use thought to promote action. But he soon realized that he could not summon the wind and thunder with ink and brush alone. He turned to a more radical path, the propagation of Marxism. Cultural ideals are lofty, but reality is always low. Between the two, the new culture movement was in a tug-of-war. On the one hand, vernacular language, free love, anti-ritualism. On the other hand, war, poverty, bureaucrats, and the remnants of feudalism. It was like a beautiful dream. But before the dawn, it was awakened by a more complex historical reality. The new culture movement is one of the most brilliant burns in China's modern intellectual history. It raised the banners of democracy and science in an attempt to awaken a nation that had been asleep for thousands of years. But no matter how hot the ideal is, it has to face the coldness of reality. These thinkers, professors, and editors who want to change the country. They can write manifestos that will change the world. But they cannot really participate in the table of rule. They wanted to transform the country, but they couldn't wield power. They wanted to awaken the people, but they often overestimated their readiness. There were no modern citizens in China, only hungry peasants. Talk of science. Freedom. In the midst of the war and the suffering of the people, these words sounded like extravagant talk. This is where the greatest tension lies in the new culture movement. It wants to replace political revolution with cultural change. It believes in thinking first, but forgets that reality is often impatient to wait. Their weapons were books, magazines, podiums, and pencils. But in front of the forces that really dominate history, these were too fragile, too gentle, and too idealistic. When the new culture movement came to a crossroads, a voice became clearer and clearer. Cultural enlightenment cannot solve China's problems, only revolution can. As a result, some of the former culture fighters took to the political arena. Some retired from their studies, and some lost their lives in the afterlife. They did not change the system of the country, but quietly shaped the soul of the country. The new culture movement may not have brought about a real-life, democratic revolution. But it taught Chinese people two words: doubt and exploration. It was not the end of China's modernization, but it was the real starting point of intellectual awakening. It left behind an indomitable light of reason for those who came after it.